Imagine this. More Americans died in the Civil War than in World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam combined. Not in distant deserts or foreign forests, but on cornfields and courthouse squares, along creek beds and churchyards, on farmland that once held family picnics and Sunday hymns. And yet, most people who lived through it rarely traveled far. Many never crossed more than 100 miles from home. The greatest national convulsion unfolded on familiar ground, beneath front porches and orchard trees, along the very roads that carried milk pails at dawn. The streets you walk today, the parks where children play, the soccer fields, the quiet cul-de-sacs, many of them rest on forgotten battlefields. Under the grass, there are traces: a bent nail from a wagon wheel, a mini ball pressed into clay, a brass button that once fastened a boy's uniform before the fever took him. You might pass a brick wall that once served as a breastwork, or a meadow where a regiment waited, whispering prayers that evaporated with the morning mist. The nation's past lies just underfoot, patient and silent, like a heartbeat under a palm. Tonight, we'll journey through the entire Civil War, not just the battles, but the human hearts behind them. We'll listen for the letters written by candlelight, the arguments at kitchen tables, the sermons that cracked with worry, the newspaper presses that clattered through midnight. We'll meet the dreamers and the doubters, the enslaved who risked everything for a horizon called freedom, the generals who sketched plans on maps that smelled of ink and rain. We'll explore the choices that ordinary people made when the ordinary world fell away. And gently, we'll step back to the spring of 1861. The air is still cool. Chimneys breathe thin ribbons of smoke over towns stitched to rivers and rails. On courthouse steps, voices rise, some hopeful, some harsh. In parlors, clocks tick with a careful, even patience. A flag is lowered here, raised there. Somewhere, a telegraph key taps its metallic whisper, carrying a rumor that will soon become history. The United States is a single country by law. But beneath the rooftops and along the fences, something is pulling taut. Threads that held North and South together begin to strain. In that soft, uncertain light, before the thunder, America stands on a narrow threshold, and the first tremor finds the floorboards. Spring, 1861. The air carries a clean bite at dawn and a soft, forgiving warmth by mid-afternoon, as if the season itself can't decide which way to lean. In southern towns, chimneys exhale blue-gray ribbons that hang low above rooftops of cedar and slate. Smoke threads itself through magnolia branches and along verandas, where the last ash of last night's fire still holds a faint orange memory. In the distance, a train sighs and then is gone, leaving only the soft murmur of a river pushing past pilings and cattails. On the northern streets, church bells float over brick and iron, spreading their counted notes through neighborhoods of clapboard and factory row houses. The bells ring clear and certain, a steady metronome above the rattle of cart wheels and the brief laughter of school children breaking ranks. Country roads keep their quiet. Dust lies undisturbed, where wagon tracks have fanned into pale ribs, and the fence lines lean gently, stitched with last summer's vines. Crows pick at furrows, then rise, then settle again, unhurried in the slanted light. Out here, a boot step is the loudest news for miles, and a gate latch can sound like a whole sentence. But toward the towns and the fast-growing cities, calm thins into clamor. Sashes rattle in warehouse windows, hoists creak, Doors slam and open and slam again. Inside mills belts slap and whir from floor to ceiling, and the air tastes of oil and iron filings, a mineral tang that clings to throats and cuffs. Hammers fall in a measured chorus. 1, 2, 3, drawing out sparks like brief constellations that flare and vanish on plank floors, darkened with years of shoe leather. By the rivers, steamboats fuss at their moorings, their paddle wheels idle, stirring up a lace of foam. Porters call to each other, their voices looping over stacked bales and crates stenciled with ink that smells like vinegar. Paperboys make a kind of music, too. Thin, insistent, tossing headlines spun fresh from presses that never truly sleep. The sheets are warm, still damp at the edges, carrying type pressed into them with a dampened thunder. Each letter, a tiny iron footstep across the page. Names skitter through the columns. Towns you've visited, towns you haven't, men you've heard of, and men you'll soon know. Rumor and reply, accusation and defense. Ink setting like a verdict under the noon sun. Night still arrives gently in the countryside. Lanterns bloom on porches, and the sound of a fiddle slips from an open door, bending notes until they become almost another kind of speech. The earth releases the day's heat with a slow breath, and frogs take up their patient counting from the ditch lines. In the cabins that dot the fields, walls rubbed smooth by hands and seasons, flames lift and hover behind tin reflectors. The light is small but stubborn, pooling on rough tables, picking out a spoon's curve, a thread spool, the seam of a coat being mended for a morning that will come too soon. Tallow and wood smoke braid together, and the room holds that braided scent like a kept promise. In cities, darkness wears a different shape. Gas lamps wink on, one by one, throwing halos onto damp brick and catching the quick shine of shoe buckles. Street vendors pack away their day. Shutters slide down, but around the edges, the night keeps working. In foundries and smithies, the staccato of hammers continues, a rain made of steel. Sparks jump, land, and die with a tiny hiss on blackened anvils. The sound of it travels, turning corners, finding alleys, then fading into the low tremor of a city that will not fully settle. On public squares, crowds thicken under torchlight. The flames shiver and bow, and faces rise out of shadow. Eager, skeptical, angry, uncertain, each one tipped with shine where the light finds cheekbone or brow. Listen long enough, and the country reveals its rhythm. The hush of fields, the grunt of river docks, the clipped precision of factory floors, the hoarse singing that floats across work yards long after the whistle. In parlors north and south, clocks mark the hour with careful dignity. Newspapers accumulate in baskets. Letters gather in corners, addressed with hands that scratch or sweep, words chosen and crossed out and chosen again. Teapots cool on grates, boots dry by hearths. Conversations begin in one room and continue in the next, like a tune carried from violin to voice to memory. In the spring light, everything looks newly minted. Cotton stands stacked like weathered snow along the levee. Wheat fields ripple as if they were shallow lakes, and the newest leaves shine with that bright, almost translucent green that won't last more than a week. You can taste iron in the water drawn from the well, sweet and cold. You can taste salt and ash at the edges of town, where smoke has pressed itself into clapboards and hats and the wool of coats. Chicory bites the tongue. Coffee wakes it. Molasses rounds it again. As Smith lifts a horseshoe with tongs, and the heat trembles the air until the doorway warps, and then he plunges the metal into water, and a ghost-white steam leaps up and is gone. There is talk on porches and talk in counting rooms, talk under elms and inside rail depots, talk that quickens and separates like cream skimming off milk. Some sentences land heavy and stay put. Others blow away as soon as they're spoken. At night meetings, torchlight shakes along the edge of a crowd like a nervous heartbeat, making shadows taller and thinner, as if the very buildings have come to listen. Words strike against words. Union, rights, honor, property, freedom, sparking bright for a moment, then slipping back into the general glow. A brass band somewhere tries a march too fast for its own breath, and even the wrong notes carry a stubborn sort of pride. Not far from any of this, the farms keep their rituals. Calves bawl, gates groan. Wind moves through wheat as though it were reading, line by line. In the small hours, when most windows have pulled their curtains to, and only the very late or the very worried remain awake, the land itself seems to lean in and listen. You can hear the tick of cooling stove plates, the soft cluck of a hen settling, the faintest drag of a pen over paper where someone, somewhere, still writes. Between the hush of the roads and the churn of the mills, between the quiet hands that mend and the hands that raise banners, a feeling gathers, subtle at first, like the way a draft finds the smallest crack under a door. It moves along fences and through depots and across pews, collecting itself piece by piece. Nothing has happened yet, not formally, not in the kind of way that makes almanacs write new lines. And still, the air bears it, a tension drawn thin and nearly invisible, the way a violin string looks smooth from the audience, though it thrums under the bow. Step by step, the season edges forward. Buds loosen. Fields darken with seed. The river rises a little and then a little more. On courthouse greens, men read out proclamations. In kitchens, flour dust lifts like smoke as dough is kneaded for tomorrow's bread. On a distant ridge, a rider pauses, hat brim pulled low, as if listening to something far off and hard to name. Bells still ring, presses still turn, and lamps still burn. But beneath their steady light, America stands at a threshold so narrow it feels like the lip of a cup. The surface is still. The hand is steady, and in that fragile balance, smoke drifting, hammers counting, candles breathing, history draws in a slow breath that will not be released gently. He was not a man of speeches. Thomas Avery measured days in fence rails and wheat rows, in the taste of well water on a hot noon, and the nicked handle of the plow that had fit his palm since his father's time. On Sunday mornings, he lifted his hat when the hymn began and kept his eyes lowered, because that felt honest. He knew the color of every field between his ridge and the river, where the soil ran red with iron, and where the clay needed breaking twice before it would take seed. He knew the particular complaining creak of his front gate and the place on the kitchen table where a knot in the pine always caught the rag when you wiped it. He knew, too, that when the courthouse bells rang and men gathered, he would go because the men he had grown up with were going, and because it is difficult to stand still when the earth around you begins to move. The year turned, and rumor, thin at first, then thick, ran the fence rows like fire through dry grass. In the evenings, he came in with the smell of the fields in his clothes, put his hat on the peg by the door, and found Sarah looking up from her mending with a question that did not need saying. Their boys sat on the floor with whittling scrap, small boats in progress, a wooden soldier with one leg. The baby slept with her mouth open, dreaming some soft dream that made her fingers flex and curl. He washed at the basin, the water in the bowl clouded with the day's work, and he studied his own face in it. The same steady eyes as his father, the same line at the corner of his mouth when he was deciding something. "Do you believe it?" Sarah asked one night, when the crickets sawed the dark into strips and the clock on the mantel sounded too loud in the small room. "I believe letters can carry thunder," he said, "and sometimes thunder rolls away." "What if it doesn't?" she said. Not a question, more like an open hand held out to see what would land in it. He did not have an answer. He could list the price of seed and the number of hands needed at harvest. He could tell you how many nights the roof would hold before it must be patched and which cow would calve earliest. But he did not know what to do with words like nation and union and rights when they swelled in a man's mouth and turned him into someone he wasn't on a Monday, but had become by Saturday. He only knew that when neighbors spoke of honor, they spoke with their father's stories behind their teeth. And when they spoke of property, their eyes slid away from the cabins by the tobacco barn. Tom had not owned another human being. He hired labor when he could afford it, and worked twice as hard when he couldn't. But the world around him was arranged on a plan older than his name, and that plan ran through lives like water through a ditch. Steady, assumed, accumulating its own momentum. He had watched men in chains pass on the road behind a trader's wagon and had not stepped out in front of it. He had watched men and women bend under summer, watched children carry wood that was too heavy, watched the way laughter could survive even in the wrong kind of silence. He had told himself that the world was large, that he was small, that he could be responsible for his own corner and no more. On the first day, he wore a faded shirt and the second-best hat, and he shook hands with men he had known since they were boys, carving initials into the schoolhouse desk. He signed his name at the table near the courthouse step, where the ink was thick and the pen scratchy. The recruiter's voice grew hoarse with repeating the oath. The flags snapped and settled. The drums found a march that made the feet feel lighter than they were. Sarah stood in the second row of women along the street, the baby's bonnet tied too tight under her chin because in a flurry of fear and motion, you pull knots tighter than you mean to. When the men began to move, the women watched their shoulders as if to memorize them. Thomas turned at the corner, the old habit of seeing home once more before the trees took it from view, and saw his wife's mouth move around his name. He lifted his hand once. Then he was a back in a line of backs, a hat in a line of hats, a blue of sky broken only by a thin white flag of cloud. Camp life came like a step into a story told by someone else. He learned tents and mess lines, the clatter of canteens against tin plates, the smell of bacon that flickered between appetizing and sickening depending on the wind. He learned the way a man's foot could blister so badly he walked as if on marbles, and how a joke told at the right moment could blunt a blade of fear. He learned names of generals he would never meet, and the names of creeks that would be shouted like commands. The companies were built from counties. The men near his fire had plowed the same soil he had. They spoke in short sentences, leaving room for the unsaid, as men who work hard often do. Nights were the worst. The air cooled enough to call up aches a man had not named in daylight, and the horizon, all iron and shadow, looked like something that wanted collecting. He wrote home when the candle and his conscience agreed. He wrote about the food because that was simple. Flour too lean of fat, coffee that tasted like it had been argued with. He wrote about the weather because weather was a thing men shared. He did not write about the talk that circled back to cause and right, or the way a man as decent as Jacob Peters could say, with tenderness in his voice, that a person might be his by law as a mule was his, because all his life he had believed it. He did not write about the dream he had 3 nights running, in which he is at the plow, and the earth bucks like a living thing under him, and when he looks back, the furrow is a breastwork, and his sons are sitting in it with their wooden soldier, and the bull wheel of a cannon rolls yet nearer. He did not add that the dream always ended in the same way, with his father standing in the far field, 2 fingers to his hat brim, as if in greeting, and then turning away. At the edge of night watches, he sometimes heard a song that did not belong to tents, something lifted from far trees and water, words he couldn't make out, the tune older than the camp. He thought at first it was his memory, some hymn from the churchyard, where cicadas sang so loud in August you had to lean forward to hear the preacher. Later, he learned the melody traveled with people whose lives traveled in different ways, sunrise to sunset, along rows not measured in acres, but in inspections, along the hard line of a lash, along the narrow cut of not being allowed to read the very words that might have reached other hands. The song was both grief and a kind of strength that frightened and moved him because he could not claim it and had not earned it, and yet could not stop hearing it once it had reached him. On a different road, and then crossing it, and then leaving all roads entirely, a woman named Eliza breathed like a runner who has drained her lungs and run on anyway. She had left at a time of calculation. Moon thin and a shade from dark, dogs quiet, the oldest man in the quarters coughing hard enough to cover the sound of a latch. She had a loaf wrapped in cloth tucked against her ribs, and a shawl she had been given by a woman who had carried a child on her hip until her hip wore sore. "You take it," the woman had said. "I can lend mine bones to the wind." Eliza knew landmarks the way sailors know stars. The twist in the river's path where willow roots splayed like hands. The oak burned at its heart that still leafed out in spring. The cabin where a white woman used to leave a jar of milk on the step on Wednesdays when her husband was away. She moved when the dark moved and became still when the dark, somehow, grew stiller, like a house settling after the lamp is blown. Her plan was not a map smoothed on a table. It was a string of hopes tied together with knots of caution. She aimed for a line she could not see but had been told of, a border that meant a new word for her body and her name. Men and women had gone before. Some had returned in chains. Some had not returned because all the world is made up of mouths and eyes and hands, and a body is only a body until someone decides it is property, at which point a body must learn to become air. On the second night, when her breath scraped her throat and the sky bent so low with stars it looked like the backs of 1,000 coins, she heard the river in front of her arguing with its own banks. There was a narrow crossing a mile east, a bar where sand gathered into a kind of promise. She had never seen it. She had only heard it described by a boy with a scar like a finger laid on his cheek. She trusted his memory because he had earned his scars the way she had earned hers, with time. She waded in. The water crept up her shins like cold hands and then to her waist, where it pulled at her shawl in a greedy, playful way she did not enjoy. If she had held fear like a bucket, it would have sloshed and spilled. She imagined instead it was a coin she would keep flat inside her palm. She took a step, then another. A fish brushed her knee, and she nearly gasped. And then she did, because a branch of something slick and alive was suddenly around her calf. She whispered a word she had learned long ago that was not a prayer, but worked like one. The river did not listen. She took the next step. Her forward foot found the bar, and the water fell away to her thighs. She walked, counting, though the numbers trembled, until her feet found stones, and then mud, and then a root that let her pull herself up onto the bank. She crawled forward on her hands and knees like a child, and then lay with her face in the dead leaves and wept without sound. By daylight, she moved like shade. The hours were a piece of cloth she folded and refolded, now sheltering in a shallow ditch, now easing through a tangle of sweet gum and vine, now crouching in a patch of broom sedge that hid her only from men on horseback, so long as those men did not look down. Hunger gnawed and then became something else, not a teeth mark, but an emptiness she could set her mind inside of, like a room with a door. On the fourth night, a light rose where she did not expect it, low and steady and too warm to be a star. She froze because freezing had saved her before. Voices came with the light, and Eliza listened. The words were northern in their edges, but southern in their caution. She heard the call and countercall she had been taught, two halves of a sentence that fit together like the halves of a walnut shell. She answered. Footsteps softened on leaf mold. The lantern drew near and tilted up, and she saw a face that was not unkind, and beyond it, another face that was not unkind either, and the lantern's light made a kind of third face out of the shared relief between them. They took her in a circle, never direct, never on a path that a man who did not need to hide would have chosen. There was a hidden room under a smokehouse and a loft above a stable where she lay with her ear against the floorboards and listened to the horses talk to each other with breath and hoof. There was a wagon whose false bottom pressed against her spine, and a child who, peering down through a crack, whispered, "You can have my biscuit," and a mother's hand that drew the child back. There was, once, the smell of soldiers, wool and iron and leather, and a sour note of unwashed worry. She held herself so still, she felt like a seed in winter. She was carried forward by a web of hands and eyes, by the stubborn belief of strangers that a human being is not a tool to be used until it breaks. She reached the Union lines not with triumph, but with the careful step of a person who has learned not to trust the end of a story just because the page turns. The camp was a geography of smoke and canvas, as men's camps always are. But there were shapes here she had not seen before. Wagons marked with a painted cross, tables where men who looked tired, and boys who looked hungry, and women who looked both at once passed out bowls without asking the wrong questions first. She saw men in blue with faces the color of hers, uniforms that did not quite fit yet, because nobody had cut them for those shoulders before. She saw a man writing names in a ledger. First names wobbled and strong, last names chosen like new shoes, sometimes tight, sometimes too loose, sometimes perfect. She said, "Eliza." And when he asked for a second name, she stopped. Not because she did not have one, but because the one she had had belonged to someone else's belonging. She considered the names she had heard in whispered stories, names of mothers and men who had paid for others, and women who had carried news under their headscarves, and a preacher who had learned to read by tracing his finger over a bulletin so many times it wore thin. She chose May, because she had stepped into the river in May, because the month felt like a door that opened in front of her. Eliza May, she said. He wrote it with the nib scratching, and then looked up as if to make sure the letters had fit the face. Welcome, Miss May, he said, as if that had always been true. In the evenings, she carried water and passed bread, and found that her hands remembered work even when the work changed its name. She watched men in blue play at cards where the coins were mostly buttons and pride, and she watched the way some laughed and then grew quiet because laughing felt like a luxury bought with someone else's loss. She listened. She boiled clothing, and the lice rose like curses, and then died like any living thing when given no quarter. She learned quickly the particular cough that meant the lungs were drowning, and she learned which herbs the older women looked for at the edges of camp. When she slept light. One ear for the whistle of shells that sometimes came like rude birds from farther down the line. One ear for the voice of a child if a child cried. One afternoon, a line of captured men came through the camp under guard, and among the faces, sweat-streaked, dust-powdered, stubborn, Eliza saw a man whose eyes met hers and did not look away. His jacket was gray and torn at the elbow. His hands were rope-burned. He had a scar like a comma near his left eyebrow. He looked like any man who had been taught to keep his mouth closed until asked to open it. He looked, specifically, like a man who had known the bend of a plow harness and the weight of a hay fork. He looked, in a brief shiver of recognition she could not name, like someone who had once watched a wagon of chained bodies go by and had said nothing, and like someone who had once left a dipper of water at the edge of a field and thought that counted for something. He lowered his eyes first. The guard shouted something cheerful and cruel and moved the men along. Thomas made his oath and kept it. He stood when told to stand, and marched when told to march, and fired when told to fire, and discovered that firing was nothing like he had imagined when boys made noise behind the school. The sound of a real volley punched the ribs as if with a fist. The air filled with a taste like old pennies and hot rain, and the little pieces of bark ripped from the trees stung like insult. He saw a man he had known since he was 12 fall as if he had been told to lie down by a stern father. The first time he shot at another man, he missed on purpose and told himself he had not. And then he missed less on purpose because the noise was too great for such fine distinctions. And then he was sure he had struck nobody because surely the human body could not be turned off by so little a gesture as tightening a finger. He found later a smear on his sleeve that was not mud. He did not write about that either. He wrote about his neighbor's cornbread recipe and how it had failed in a pan too thin. He wrote about a mule that kicked a corporal hard enough to raise a theory, as the sergeant put it. He wrote about the river that looked like the one he knew, but was not. The way a cousin looks like family, but will not remember your birthdays. He wrote to his sons, "Mind your mother. The corn will want hilling after the rain. Watch out for the worm." He wrote to Sarah, "I think of your hands." He meant that he thought of them tying a bonnet, lifting a skillet, touching the line of his jaw when he had a fever once and did not tell her how bad it was. When he was taken, if taken is the right word for being gathered up after a fight like a scattered stack of cards, he was surprised at how his body seemed to keep wanting to go forward when forward had stopped. The Union men around him were not devils or saints. They were men who were as tired as he was and smelled like him and laughed like men laugh when authority is just out of earshot. They searched him and found his knife and his letter. and gave him back the letter. He felt shame like a sunburn, everywhere and irrational. For a night and a day, he sat under an oak whose bark had gathered more initials than he could count, and he thought about the line between duty and right and how thin it had become under his feet. On the second day, he saw her, the woman from the camp, bearing a bucket with the thick-set patience of someone who has carried water since childhood. She did not look at him. She looked at the ground in front of her feet and then at the sky, once, as if to check that it was still there. He had never spoken with a woman like her as equals, not in the counted daylight. He had spoken with, and over, and around, and near. He had ordered and been obeyed. He had joked and been met with the joke a person who must laugh gives you. He had felt, at moments, the wrongness in his bones, like grit in a shoe, and not known what to do about it beyond walking differently for a while. Now she set the bucket on a table near where the captured men waited, and the water made a sound like a throat clearing, and he lifted the dipper because thirst is one thing that makes men forget categories. "Thank you," he said, because his mother had taught him that if you cannot be certain of anything else, you can be certain of courtesy. Her eyes met his. They did not soften. They were not unkind. They were like the river had been, not for him or against him, not impressed by him, not counting him beyond the moment he might be harmless or not. She did not say, "You're welcome." She did not say anything at all. She moved to the next table, where the next bucket was needed, and the next man said the same two words, and she withheld from him the same mercy she withheld from Thomas, the mercy of pretending this was normal. In the guard shade, someone began to sing softly, a tune that Thomas had heard before and now understood better than he wanted to. It was a song about crossing, which might have meant a river or a life or a day. Songs are good that way, furnishing more room in the meaning than the words have by themselves. He found himself humming along and stopped because the sound of his own hum near that song felt like a theft. He drank again because water was honest. That night, he lay on the ground with his jacket rolled under his head and looked up through oak leaves. He thought of Sarah at the table, the knot in the pine catching the rag. He thought of his boys, their pocket knives worrying a piece of wood into something that did not yet know what it wanted to become. He thought of the baby's hand on his shirt front, flexible as a starfish. He thought of the woman at the water table, how she had looked through him and past him, and how right that had felt. He took his hat off and put it on his chest because it seemed necessary to unburden his head of something. Sarah, back in the house that creaked where it had always creaked, learned the weight of new kinds of silence. There was the quiet of rain's first hour, and the quiet when a skillet cooled, and the quiet that comes right after laughter, where laughter had landed and broken into pieces, and the pieces rolled under the table and refused to come out. The neighbors took care as neighbors do. A pie appeared after church, an offer to mend the fence, a boy sent to carry water from the spring. News came like weather, sometimes too much, sometimes not enough, always ungovernable. She read every letter 3 times the day it arrived, and then again on Thursday, as if Thursday were made for rereading, and then again on a night when the baby had colic, and the only light came from embers she stirred with the poker, careful not to wake the older children. In those hours, she let the letters speak aloud in the room, Thomas's words borrowing the space where his body would have stood. Once she went down to the creek where the sycamores wove light and shade and washed the clothes against the flat rock. A woman from the quarters worked a little farther downstream, her arms dark and strong, her motions sure and right. They had shared this creek for years and had not shared more than a handful of sentences. The woman glanced up with the flick of recognition that passes between people who live in the same small orbit. "Your man gone," she said. It was not a question. "He is," Sarah said. "Mine too," the woman said, and then laughed softly, without humor, though not by choice. They both worked in silence for a while, the slap of cloth on rock a steady beat that could comfort if you let it. Sarah wanted to say something like, "I hope he comes back to you," and then understood that the coming back might mean chains, and she closed her mouth on the shape of that sentence and let the water do the talking. After a time, the woman said, "If you need sage for fever, it grows along the fence. Smell for it. It tells you what it is." Sarah nodded because there was nothing to pay her with except gratitude. In the Union camp, Eliza May learned to write her name. A chaplain's wife, stern as a yardstick, kind as warm bread, put the chalk in her hand and said, "Here," without the pride some people wear when they think they are making history. Eliza set the letters down, shy as foals, and then stronger, and then with a tail on the Y because she liked the elegance of it. She wrote it on a scrap of board, and then on a corner of newspaper, and then in the dust with her finger when nobody was looking. She did not know if the future would ask her to sign anything. She liked now the possibility. In the weeks that followed, the paths of Thomas and Eliza crossed twice, and then 3 times, because camps are small cities, and water and food and wood make a triangle men and women must keep tracing. They did not speak more than the words, "Duty squeezes out." Pass that. Mind the handle. Hot. Here. But Thomas watched, once, and saw her pause with a bowl halfway between table and man, because a child had stumbled and had caught herself with a palm flat on the ground, in that way children do. Eliza set the bowl down, and went to the child, and lifted her, and dusted her, and looked into her face, not to see if she was hurt, but to let her know someone would be the audience of her hurt if it came. It is a small thing, and the largest thing. He did not know where his belief ended and another's began. He did not know if he had been brave or merely obedient. He did know that the idea of right had moved closer to him and was no longer something you heard in speeches, but something you saw in the square of a woman's shoulders and the way a boy laid down his life for a man who did not look like his cousin. He carried these knowing things the way he carried his tin cup, hooked to his belt, clanking now and then to remind him. The world had widened without his permission. He suspected it would not narrow again. One evening, near dusk, when the camp thinned to the low murmur it kept before the dark slapped down fully, he saw the chaplain's wife and Eliza at the edge of the parade ground. The older woman held a book, and Eliza held nothing but attention. The woman read aloud. Eliza repeated the sounds. It was a psalm. Thomas knew because he had heard his mother's voice in another small room shaping those same sounds. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures," the woman said. "He maketh me," Eliza repeated, and then without being prompted, "to lie down." The words wore a groove in the air between them, and for a moment the world looked like a bench where 3 could sit, not 2. Thomas did not approach. He kept a respectful distance, because sometimes the kindest thing a man can do is to not be the center of the scene. When orders came and the prisoners moved again, he stood and counted the buttons he had left, because that was a habit, and he looked once more at the water table, because that had become one too. Eliza did not turn her head. The camp drew itself up for the next day and the next. The night sank, and on the farthest ridge, a bugle sent a note that sounded like something between a question and an answer. Thomas took his place in line. He felt the weight of duty on one shoulder and the weight of doubt on the other. And if you had put a scale under his feet, it would have measured nothing, because a man is not made of iron and argument. He is made of breath and bone and the invisible ledger of choices. He moved forward. Back in Virginia, Sarah lit a candle, and then another, because the first did not give enough light to stitch by. The baby murmured. The boys slept with their hands open, palms bearing the ghost prints of the wooden knives and boats they had held all afternoon. She put Thomas's letters in order, the dates a small spine of time. Outside, the wind moved through the wheat with the sound of a hand smoothing a wrinkled sheet. She set her needle and drew it through, not quickly and not slow. Each stitch a promise made to nobody and to everyone at once. Somewhere between them all, between a woman learning to write her name in chalk, a man in gray counting his remaining buttons, a wife lifting a candle to catch the thread, and children sleeping with the untroubled gravity of children. The season turned another notch. The smell of wood smoke deepened. The nights lengthened by the measure of a single breath, then another. In this narrowing light, choices clarified and blurred in the same hour. And as the armies felt for each other along the map, like blind hands finding the edges of a table, the lives inside that larger drawing beat on, steady where they could be steady, brave where they could be brave, unsure where they must be unsure. The story widened. The hearts inside it continued, each with its own cadence, each with its own horizon. The country did not divide only along a line on a map. It divided along habits, money, memory, and the meanings of words. North and South carried different work in their hands, different futures in their ledgers, and different hymns in their throats. When the season turned toward war, these differences, some born of soil and weather, some deliberately inscribed in law, rose to the surface like letters revealed by heat. In the north, iron and steam crowded the daylight. Factories stitched towns together, brick to brick, like a continuous thought. Rails unfurled westward and eastward, a lattice of ambition that rattled the crockery on kitchen shelves and made even remote towns feel suddenly near a city they would never see. Foundries poured cannon and kettles. Machine shops threw off gears as casually as wind throws leaves. On the docks, bale hooks flashed, and hemp lines burned the palms of men whose names were shouted in half a dozen accents. Ships carried coal and cloth, flour and fish, and humble barrels that smelled of apples and brine. Banks grew stout behind columns. Counting rooms learned to speak in numbers that made ordinary men blink. Newspapers ran on coal and conviction, their presses kicking out pages that crackled with headlines and ink-stained certainty. The North's creed, said aloud or simply assumed, was that labor, free labor, built a man as surely as it built a city. A person could begin with nothing and accumulate a skill, a wage, a room of his own. Perhaps one day, a shop, his name painted over the door. This was both truth and myth, hope and hard arithmetic. Wages did not always keep pace with hunger. Tenements multiplied as quickly as sermons about dignity. Still, the idea that a man owned himself, his hours, his hands, grew into a kind of civic religion. Even those who feared immigrant competition or despised abolitionists often cherished the phrase free soil, free labor, free men, because it promised a future that felt earned rather than inherited. South of the line, wealth took a different form, rooted in acres the color of rust and river mud. Cotton had turned into a king with a soft white crown and iron laws. Tobacco and rice still commanded respect, but it was cotton that brokered the South's confidence. Cotton that fed Liverpool's mills and balanced ledgers in New Orleans, Charleston, and Mobile. Plantation houses rose on knolls, their facades wide and assured, facing avenues of live oaks trained into cathedral aisles. But the beauty, every board planned, every column painted, was financed by bondage. Enslaved people planted and chopped, picked and ginned, cooked and built, endured and imagined. The system reached into dawn and midnight, into marriage and faith, into the naming of children and the keeping of dreams. Law guarded it, custom enforced it, violence maintained it. The South's richest families spoke of honor and liberty, while sitting at tables made smooth by the same hands they claimed as property. Between the great houses and the red dirt farms lay yards and cabins and rooms without locks. And in those rooms, mothers taught children to keep two languages: the language of survival, which kept a person breathing, and the language of hope, which kept a person human. Men and women stole time out of the day, the way someone steals warm coals from a dying fire, discreetly, with purpose. They married without the protection of law, and stayed married by stubbornness and ingenuity. They sang to name their grief and to chart their routes. They mapped the night by the North Star, and the day by the kindness of a single stranger at a single crossroads. And when the word contraband began to circulate in Union camps, awkward, bureaucratic, almost comic in its clumsiness, it hid inside its syllables a quiet revolution, the enslaved transforming themselves into freed people by crossing a line and refusing to cross back. Slavery was not the background of the conflict. It was the engine. Economists could talk tariffs and politicians could juggle compromises like torches, but the fuel was bondage. Who could be bought and sold? Who could learn to read? Who could testify in court? Who could stand upright in the street without a paper folded in his pocket? Those who denied it spoke in abstractions: state sovereignty, constitutional balance, as if you could erase a human face by introducing a Latin phrase. Those who affirmed it did so in pulpits and pamphlets, arguing that Scripture bent to their will, that Providence had apportioned hierarchy as neatly as it had separated day from night. And those who fought it, ministers in plain coats, women with trunks full of petitions, publishers with debts and deadlines, kept insisting that no republic could survive the habit of owning people and calling it a tradition. Women, North and South, stepped into the widening space where need and nerve meet. Before the first summer of war had burned itself into memory, sewing circles became supply chains, and parlor rhetoric became logistics. In northern towns, the U.S. Sanitary Commission rose from a few desks and a blizzard of letters into a continent-spanning apparatus of care. Fairs that glittered like small cities, wagons that rattled toward hospitals with cots and clean bandages, inspectors who learned the geography of misery and would not ignore it. Women wrote manuals on field hygiene and blanketed trains with quilts stitched from parlor curtains. They learned to boil lice out of uniforms and shame careless quartermasters into doing better. In the Confederacy, where resources thinned as the war thickened, women bartered ingenuity for absence. They replaced coffee with parched sweet potatoes, dye with walnut hulls, cloth with homespun that scratched but held. They wrote to governors demanding salt, to husbands demanding honesty, to newspapers demanding price controls. When the bread ran out in Richmond and the rumors proved true that flour existed, only not for the price a mother with 3 children could pay, women, many of them soldiers' wives and soldiers' mothers, surged into the streets and made the government hear what hunger sounds like when it finds its voice. Their letters are still salted with fury and practicality. Send shoes, send soap, send him home if his wound will never heal. Newspapers exercise the peculiar power of daily certainty. In New York, editors leaned over galley proofs while the presses shuddered like enormous horses, impatient for the word, "Go telegraph." Boys ran with strips of paper, still warm from the key. Compositors set type with a rhythm that felt like breathing. Letter, letter, space, word, letter, letter, space, word. Harper's Weekly spread woodcuts across kitchen tables from Maine to Minnesota. Lincoln's long face carved in parallel lines. A battlefield drawn as if seen by a hawk. A tent hospital with lantern light falling in circles on sutures and sleeves. Currier and Ives turned history into lithograph, and the lithograph into wallpaper for the nation's imagination. Not all papers pushed the same direction. Copperhead editors in northern towns wrote with acid pens about war's cost and Lincoln's overreach, sometimes shading into sympathy for a Confederacy they claimed only to understand. In southern cities, shortages of paper led printers to improvise. Sermons and legal forms turned over and printed on their blank backs. Margins narrowed until the pages looked as if they'd been starved. What they did not lack was persuasion. Editorials sang of states' rights while refusing to name the right at stake. Poetry cornered itself around valor and home, and in the ad columns, even as the war lengthened, you could still find, here and there, notices that revealed the old economy refusing to die. Auctions of farm implements and other property. The other property described with weights and skills instead of names. Religion did not simply bless the contending sides, it wrestled with them. In northern churches, abolitionist preachers thundered about Pharaoh and the Red Sea, about the sin that clung like smoke to everything it touched. Some congregations fractured under the strain. Good Christians who had nodded along with mild sermons found themselves stiffening in pews when the words turned specific, when a pastor named a slave by a name from the week's paper and prayed for her out loud. Quaker meetings continued their steady ministry of abolition, quiet as snowfall and just as persistent. Black churches, already schools of endurance, became recruitment halls, relief centers, and sacred theaters where the enslaved, newly free, or newly arrived could shape grief into testimony and testimony into resolve. In Southern pulpits, ministers argued with Scripture until it said what they needed it to say. They found passages about servants and masters and ignored the larger river of liberation that runs from Genesis to Revelation. They preached obedience as if it were identical to salvation. They spoke of a covenant between God and the Confederacy, a theology that withered under the glare of the battlefield but did not die. Bad ideas, like hardy weeds, find new soil when the old patch is plowed under. And through it all, enslaved people carried a theology the country tried to silence, a faith that refused to accept the slaveholder's God, a faith of exodus and resurrection, of water that parts and walls that fall, of spirituals that held maps and meanings in the same verse. Cities sharpened these contrasts into something you could smell and hear. New York, a feverish metropolis, woke early and went late. Its avenues divided between wealth that glittered and poverty that crowded tenements with airless rooms. On Broadway, gaslight and theater posters promised a different war altogether. Neat, heroic, over by Curtains Fall. Down by the river, the war felt industrial. Bales and barrels, the slap of rope, the creak and whine of loaded wagons aimed for railheads that stitched the Republic to itself one iron spike at a time. The Board of Trade shouted futures into being. Wall Street read the war as a ledger. Gains, losses, a rumor priced by noon. In 5 points, a different arithmetic. Wages, rent, bread. Immigrant neighborhoods nurtured both Union regiments and resentment, the same streets sending men to the front. And, in an infamous July, sending mobs into the open to riot against a draft they felt born to bear, while wealthy men bought exemptions, and black citizens, free in law, were assaulted in practice. The city survived, chastened, with scars it pretended were shadows. Richmond bore itself like a capital that had been willed into being by rhetoric and risk. The Tredegar Iron Works hammered the Confederacy into form. Rails and rifles, cannon whose bellies drank rivers of molten iron. Government buildings sprouted files and proclamations. The streets grew familiar with uniforms and the grit of shortages. Women learned to stretch meal with imagination. Men learned how loudly silence can speak when bad news travels faster than the mail. The city had the elegant sheen of its old ambitions. Avenues of houses with tall windows and taller pride, and the diminuendo of its new reality, bread queues and Confederate currency fluttering toward worthlessness. In its markets and hospitals and government offices, Richmond was both nerve center and pressure cooker, a place where decisions made at desks translated into hunger at kitchen tables in a matter of weeks. Chicago, striding up from the lake with impatience bordering on arrogance, handled the war like a problem in logistics it intended to solve. Rails converged like spokes, and grain elevators rose with a kind of secular piety toward efficiency. The city's voice was the ring of hammers and the whistle of locomotives, the quick steps of clerks across floors that smelled of pine and ink. The Board of Trade learned to read weather and war together. Rain in Iowa, casualty reports in Tennessee, and turned the combination into price. Abolitionist speakers found loud audiences and louder adversaries. Churches filled with sermons that sounded like action plans. Halls filled for rallies where the maps on the walls wore colored pins like wounds and promises. If New York modeled finance and Richmond displayed resolve, Chicago suffered from an unapologetic appetite for the future. It trusted that the Republic would endure because it could not imagine a market that didn't. Between and beyond the cities sprawled 1,000 smaller geographies. Mill towns where the sound of looms washed over streets like surf. Courthouse squares where lawmen posted broadsides that turned boys into soldiers. River landings where news arrived in packets and drifted down the dock like smoke. In these places, propaganda didn't call itself propaganda. It called itself a song. The battle cry of freedom raised neck hairs in northern halls. The Bonnie Blue flag thumped pride into southern floors. Sheet music lay open on parlor pianos, and people who could barely read a newspaper could belt a chorus by the second verse. Broadsides promised bounties in type so large it outran caution. Lithographs turned generals into household saints, their beards and boots as familiar as uncles. The social fabric did not rip cleanly. It frayed, it snagged, it unraveled in some places and held in others through sheer stubbornness. In border states, cousins argued across fence rails until they fell silent, and then sometimes aimed muskets across them. In neighborhoods that had been merely unfriendly, the war taught a new etiquette of suspicion. Who you nodded to, who you avoided at market, whose shutters stayed closed when parades passed. Teachers in one-room schools removed certain readers from the shelf. Librarians tucked abolitionist tracts where only specific fingers would find them. In some towns, a single editor determined whether the air felt breathable. In others, a single pastor did. Everywhere, the telegraph stitched a vibrating line through the nation's nerves. Tap, tap, tap. A rumor becomes a truth, becomes a funeral. And yet, even as the country argued itself raw, its ordinary rituals insisted on being observed. Weddings were celebrated with bread that rose despite rationing. Funerals were marked with hand-lettered cards, black-edged and precise. Harvests were brought in by hands that shook. Babies were named for men who were not present, and for women who had risen to occasion after occasion until nobody bothered to call it occasion anymore. In kitchens, people read aloud from papers, and in barracks, people read aloud from letters, and everywhere the act of reading bound one breathing person to another. The war was fought by armies. It was endured by a populace. Through this breadth of experience ran the same stubborn theme. Who counts? Does a life count because law says it does, or because the heart recognizes itself in the face across from it? The North, divided over many things, increasingly rallied around the conviction that a republic built on bondage was a contradiction that could not stay politely seated any longer. The South, divided by class and region and ambition, increasingly staked its survival on the argument that hierarchy was natural and therefore righteous. Women turned kitchens into commissaries and parlors into hospitals, and, in doing so, demonstrated a different power entirely. The power to define what care looks like when the world neglects it. Newspapers turned opinion into an industrial product. Pulpits turned conscience into marching orders. Songs turned memory into a communal possession. And beneath it all, the people for whom the war meant everything, those held in slavery, saw the country with a clarity only danger can produce. They tested the edges of the new reality, moving toward Union lines like iron filings toward a magnet, pulling their families along or sending word back by ways that left no tracks. They took up work in camps, in kitchens, on docks, in hospitals. They enlisted when the uniforms were finally cut to fit them, carrying muskets with a precise pride that read as a proclamation, "I belong to myself." They gave the nation not only labor, but a syllabus of meaning. Freedom is not a word you declare. It is a life you protect. So the social world of 1861 and the years after was not merely an arrangement of economies and votes. It was a vast, humming apparatus of persuasion and survival, where mills and mansions, pulpits and print shops, kitchens and counting rooms all exerted their forces. It was the hush of a farm lane at dawn and the racket of a factory at noon, the ache of a woman's back over a wash tub, and the thrill of a sermon that names a sin without blinking, the crack of a telegraph key and the soft tear of a bread loaf divided in two. It was New York's avid clamor, Richmond's gallant strain, Chicago's sharp-shouldered confidence. It was the sorrowing, stubborn insistence of millions that the words of the Declaration had to grow skin and breath. And under the bells and smoke and argument, a quieter truth gathered its strength. A nation is not its monuments, nor its ledgers, nor even its laws, unless those laws protect the least safe person under their shade. That conviction spread, name by name, hand by hand, hearth by hearth, until it became the kind of pressure that moves history the way a slow river moves a continent, imperceptibly at first, then undeniably. From that pressure, the war drew not only its fuel, but its direction. From that pressure would come, soon enough, a series of choices on battlefields and in cabinet rooms that would begin to turn the country toward a different weather. History tends to look tidy in hindsight, a line of dates, a staircase of outcomes. But the Civil War did not arrive as a staircase, it arrived as a storm. It began officially when guns opened on Fort Sumter in the gray light of April 12, 1861, and flame bloomed where the harbor water should have held only reflection. For 34 hours, Charleston watched its own future written in smoke. The fort surrendered. No one on either side died in the fire, which made the moment feel, deceptively, like a ritual, an exchange of thunder rather than blood. Yet by the time the war ended at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865, more than 600,000 American lives had been spent to teach the country what it meant to promise liberty and then try to live up to it. In those opening months, crowds treated war like a pageant. The first heavy test came along Bull Run, a meandering Virginia stream, where civilians rode out with picnic baskets to watch their armies make sense of the noise. Instead, they saw confusion become curriculum. Men new to marching learned what it felt like when a regiment turns to smoke under fire. Officers new to command learned how quickly plans collapse on contact. Lines broke. A retreat became a rout. The capital braced. The country discovered that it had mistaken eagerness for readiness and found, on the wrong end of the lesson, that war demands both. The following spring, the Union tried a new geometry. Down the Virginia Peninsula, along roads that sank under rain, the Army of the Potomac edged toward Richmond like a chess player with too much respect for his opponent. Defensive earthworks multiplied. Swamps whispered the names of fevers. The Confederacy, feeling the noose, responded with audacity. Thomas Stonewall Jackson moved through the Shenandoah Valley as if reading music only he could hear, notes of speed and surprise that threw a far larger foe off tempo. Summer burned forward. The 7 days around Richmond turned fields into equations that resolved into stalemate. The war taught another lesson. Courage could not replace coordination, and defensive resolve can act like a second army. Out west, where rivers wrote the map and steamboats did the marching, the conflict developed a different grammar. In April 1862, at a Tennessee church called Shiloh, named for peace, 2 days of fighting shoved the nation's illusions aside with brutal efficiency. The first day's chaos bled into a second day's counterblow, and by the end, the dead lay where they had fallen in woods churned into paste. Shiloh announced that the war would not be won by a single glorious encounter. It would be won, if at all, by endurance and adaptation. In that theater, a relatively unknown brigadier, Ulysses S. Grant, learned that the shortest path to victory often ran straight through the unpleasant middle of things, and that retreat satisfied emotion but rarely solved problems. Autumn of 1862 brought a hinge. In Maryland, along the cornfields and sunken roads near a town called Sharpsburg, the armies collided at Antietam Creek on September 17th, in what remains the bloodiest single day in American history. Morning burned through corn as tall as a man. Noon found the Dunker Church wrapped in powder smoke. Afternoon turned a country lane into a canal of death. Neither side broke the other. but the Confederate invasion of the North recoiled. President Abraham Lincoln, the tall lawyer whose calm seemed carved from weathered oak, seized the moment. He had already drafted a decree that would change the meaning of the war. Antietam's victory enough let him speak it. On January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation transformed the Union's cause from a campaign of reunion into a revolution of purpose. Wherever Union armies marched, slavery's legal cover burned away. The order did not free every enslaved person overnight, but it changed the horizon. Freedom was now a federal aim, not an incidental mercy. The proclamation did more than rearrange law. It invited new soldiers into the struggle. Black men, long denied the chance to defend a nation that had refused to defend them, enlisted in regiments that stitched USCT on their identities, United States Colored Troops. They trained under suspicious eyes and carried muskets into battles where success earned them a fraction of a white man's pay, and failure threatened fates worse than a soldier's death. At Fort Wagner, in Louisiana's fields, at New Market Heights, they made an argument with their bodies that no editorial could rebut. Citizenship, once proven in blood, cannot be denied in good faith. Their families followed the armies not as cargo, but as claimants. Workers, nurses, teachers, preachers, and children building small, stubborn communities along a moving front. The following summer, the war traced two great arcs toward decision. In Pennsylvania, along ridges and orchards near the town of Gettysburg, fate accumulated over 3 days in July 1863. The first day's skirmishes drew men like sparks draw breath. The second day flung brigades at wheat fields and rocky knobs with names that sounded like old jokes. Little Round Top, until the ground learned new definitions for hold. The third day sent a mile-wide line of gray forward under a sun that made the air vibrate. They crossed fences and an invisible boundary between valor and catastrophe. Artillery plowed gaps in the line. Musketry stitched it closed and ripped it open again. When the smoke lifted, the Confederate tide had crested and begun to ebb. Gettysburg did not end the war, but it bent its spine. 500 miles west, the Mississippi River learned a new master. After a campaign of feints and ferries, Grant tightened a ring around Vicksburg, the city on the bluff that called itself the Gibraltar of the Confederacy. Siege, that most patient of strategies, starved confidence as surely as it starved stomachs. On July 4th, Vicksburg surrendered, and with it, the river fell into Union hands from source to sea. The Confederacy split, not only on a map, but in its ability to feed itself, to move men and messages, to believe in its own inevitability. Two victories, one of collision, one of compression, arrived within a day of each other and gave the North both a narrative and a navigable artery. Leadership in these years became a study in temperament. Lincoln, who looked like a man carved by a careful whittler from a single stick, understood politics as a patient craft. He wrote with a clarity that felt like kindness and wielded patience like a tool. He grew into the war's demands, learning which generals to indulge and which to remove, which words to save for later and which to spend now. He visited hospitals with a grief that never turned theatrical. He learned to sit with silence until it yielded a sentence good enough to put on paper forever. Across from him in Richmond, Jefferson Davis, a West Point-trained soldier with a fierce sense of honor and a narrower sense of flexibility, managed a confederation that disliked being managed. He wrestled not only with armies, but with governors who insisted that the very principle that formed their nation, state sovereignty, entitled them to disobey. Where Lincoln used humor to oil the machinery of compromise, Davis used dignity, which squeaks where humor slips by. In the field, Robert E. Lee commanded the Army of Northern Virginia with an engineer's precision and a patriarch's gravity. He read terrain like scripture, coaxing miracles from hills and hedgerows, turning smaller numbers into sharper knives. His men loved him because he asked everything and gave everything he could. His boldness produced tactical brilliance, Chancellorsville's audacious flank march, and strategic hazard, as at Gettysburg, where faith in the offensive spirit dashed itself against well-held ground. Ulysses S. Grant, rising by proof rather than reputation, owned a different genius. He refused to be impressed by setbacks. War, he seemed to believe, was a matter of applied pressure. Steady, unsentimental, relentless. He did not throw lives away. He spent them with calculation, and then slept, and then returned to the ledger. By 1864, Lincoln gave him the largest arithmetic in the war, overall command. That year, the conflict turned into a grindstone. In Virginia's thickets and clearings, the wilderness, Spotsylvania's muleshoe, Cold Harbor's grim arithmetic, Grant and Lee locked teeth. The cost was monstrous. Trenches bit the earth and would not let go. The two armies learned the future by accident. Field fortifications, rapid rail movement, telegraph-coordinated campaigns, the ugly adolescence of modern war. Grant did not win beautiful victories. He made it impossible for Lee to replace what he lost. Meanwhile, in the West, William Tecumseh Sherman cut his way toward Atlanta, shouldering aside Confederate defenses with flanking movements like patient chess problems, until the city fell in September. Then he turned his force into a moving argument about the South's capacity to make war. His march to the sea carved a swath of wrecked rails and empty storehouses, not to punish civilians, he argued, but to demonstrate that the Confederacy's sinews were severed. It worked. The Confederacy felt its bones. All the while, beneath orders and maps, the human world continued. Families fled across lines that moved like tides. Refugees, freed people, deserters, widows, invented towns from tents and resolve. Teachers carried primers into places where learning had been contraband and found pupils whose hunger for letters rivaled any hunger for bread. Black preachers organized congregations on the edges of camps. The first black elected officials tested their voices at local meetings that smelled of lamp oil and hope. Women, white and black, learned the craft of public work as if they had always known it and only needed the door opened. The war's end came as most endings do, suddenly, after a long preparation. Petersburg, the rail junction that fed Richmond like a vein to a heart, held out through a winter of mud and despair. In April 1865, Union attacks broke the lines like thawing ice breaks under a boot. Richmond, the capital, emptied into smoke. Davis and his cabinet fled by train, their nation reduced to luggage and a rumor. Lee, shadowed by hunger and pursued by arithmetic, turned west, hoping for supplies and a miracle. He found instead a small courthouse village and a general in a rumpled private's coat. In the parlor of Wilmer McLean, who had once tried to escape war by moving inland, Grant wrote terms that were not vindictive. The men shook hands. Outside, soldiers cheered until Lee asked them to stop, and Grant asked his men not to exult. Dignity, for once, overruled spectacle. Within days, other armies followed their lead. The fighting, not everywhere but enough, quieted. The war took Lincoln 4 days later. On the evening of April 14th, he went to a theater to watch a light play after a dark year. A man with a pistol and a grievance made himself history's instrument for a moment, and then history's caution forever. Lincoln died at 7:22 the next morning, and Washington wore black. The nation would finish the work without the man whose sentences had helped it think. That work, Reconstruction, proved both visionary and fragile. First came the amendment that closed the original scandal, the 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, abolished slavery except as a punishment for crime, a clause whose shadow would lengthen into later centuries. Then the 14th, 1868, defined citizenship and promised equal protection under the law, translating battlefield courage into constitutional text. The 15th, 1870, declared that the right to vote could not be abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, a sentence whose future would require a century of enforcement and another of vigilance. These amendments were not epilogues. They were foundations poured under an unfinished house. Reconstruction asked a hard question. How do you remake a society that was built to deny itself? For a few years, the South answered with possibility. Black legislators rose in state houses where their grandfathers had not been allowed to testify. Public schools, public anything, began to knit themselves into landscapes that had relied on private arrangements. Freedmen's Bureau agents, often with too little authority and too much work, adjudicated contracts, reunited families, and found themselves accused, by the old order, of insolence for treating black people as persons in law, and in fact. Churches became parliaments. Parliaments sometimes became churches when the hour ran long and the light ran out. But Reconstruction also met an organized refusal. Paramilitary groups, masked, mounted, nocturnal, waged a politics of terror. Redemption. They called their counter-revolution as if stealing the word would bless the deed. Northern resolve thinned under the combined weight of fatigue, corruption scandals, economic panic, and the perennial human temptation to declare a job finished because the tools have grown heavy. Compromises in Washington withdrew federal protection from those who had most earned it. A new architecture of oppression, black codes, then Jim Crow, rose like a substitute courthouse in a town that had burned the first one down. The promises of the post-war amendments remained, shimmering and stubborn, but the road to reach them wandered through generations. Even so, the war had set permanent cogs in motion. The federal government, once a quiet clerk, learned to act with consequence, to tax, to draft, to build a national currency green as new leaves, to promise pensions that knitted soldiers' futures to the state that had called them. Industry, accelerated by contracts and necessity, began to think at a scale that would define the age to come. Railroads stitched time into zones. Telegraphs taught the nation to expect news before the ink dried. Medicine carried scars forward as knowledge. Triage, anesthesia, organized nursing, the recognition that cleanliness is not fussy but life-saving. Literature learned a plainer voice. Photography made portraits of grief and duty that would outlast those who sat for them. And freedom, contested, partial, deferred, changed its shape in the American mind. No longer an inheritance claimed mostly by those who had always counted, it became a question to be asked on behalf of those who had been excluded. Is liberty a possession, or is it a trust? The war's answer was complicated but unmistakable. Freedom widens when protected by law and embodied in custom, when citizens insist that the Constitution does not merely forbid tyranny, but requires dignity. The Emancipation Proclamation, born of a battlefield and a pen, had begun that widening. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments set its width in text. Later generations would test its load. If you lay the war out as a timeline, it looks like this. A bombardment in April 1861. Early confidence punctured at Bull Run. A Western awakening at Shiloh. A tactical draw with strategic consequence at Antietam. A turning pair in July 1863. Gettysburg and Vicksburg. A year of attrition that taught the earth to wear trenches. A march that renamed total war as a theory Americans could understand. A siege that starved a capital. A handshake in a parlor. A pistol in a theater. A trio of amendments. A noisy experiment in rebuilding. A quieter counter-revolution that would, in turn, call forth another century of struggle. But if you stand inside the timeline instead of above it, the war is also a library of smaller entries. A man who read his first book by lamplight in a contraband camp. A woman who organized a fair that bought 100 hospital beds. A soldier who learned to pronounce the name of a comrade whose skin was not like his and never forgot it. A widow who kept a ledger of debts and a ledger of mercies and balanced them, impossibly, to make a life. From Fort Sumter's first orange flash to Appomattox's quiet ink, the Civil War forced the United States to decide whether the sentence, "all men are created equal," would remain an aspiration or become a plan. It did not finish the plan, but it wrote enough of it down, on parchment and in blood, that the rest could not be honestly ignored. And as the century turned, and another, the echoes persisted. In marches and courtrooms, in classrooms and churches, in the way children learn to spell the word citizen and then spend a lifetime defining it. The war ended in 1865, yes, but the work it began, making law answer to conscience and custom answer to law, continued and continues in the long American evening. Day one at Gettysburg begins almost by accident, the way a summer storm sometimes arrives from a blue sky. Cavalry screens find each other west of town near McPherson's Ridge. Dust plumes lift like genies. Skirmishers spread into fence lines and orchards. The land is ordinary, wheat and pasture, a Lutheran seminary, a town with tidy streets, yet within an hour it feels chosen. Messages ride in on lathered horses. Hold here, extend there, watch the right. The first volleys snap the day in half. Men who woke with the taste of coffee still on their tongues now taste metal and powder smoke, a smear of earth when they go down behind a rail. As the morning fattens into noon, the Confederate push grows teeth. Brigades roll forward, flags wink in the heat, and the Union line bends back toward town like a sapling under wind. Civilians watch from windows. The town square swallows wounded and confusion alike. Retreat becomes a crowd, becomes a flood up Cemetery Hill, where men finally turn and take root. The ground has chosen its shape, Union clinging to the high spine that curls from Culp's Hill down through Cemetery Ridge. Confederates massing in the farmland and timber to the west and north, both sides promising themselves that the second day will settle the account. It does not. Day 2 opens with heat already in the boards of fences, a stillness you can hear. Positions that look secure from a hilltop prove treacherous once a man steps into them. Orders travel late and arrive early. Intentions fray at the edges. To the Union left, Little Round Top lifts its shoulder above the fields, a knob of rock and scrub that matters because it overlooks everything. There, regiments spill their courage like water and refill it from the well of necessity. A line runs out of ammunition and doesn't run out of resolve. A bayonet charge flips the logic of the moment. Downhill, yelling, into men as tired as you are. Terror turned into a tool. In the wheat field and the peach orchard, charges and countercharges tangle until the evening light looks bruised. Men fight in patches of cover, so small one can sit in the other's shadow and never see him. At the right, on Culp's Hill, darkness folds over trenches clawed from earth with plates and bayonets. The night is not quiet. It speaks in single rifles and low moans and the dry whisper of men digging because tomorrow might still come. Day 3 draws its breath forever. Noon feels like an hour held at arm's length. On Seminary Ridge, Confederate lines form with parade ground neatness that reads like bravery and like fate refusing to learn. On Cemetery Ridge, Union guns settle into their habits, crews moving with that odd, precise grace men acquire when doing a deadly job well. Artillery opens, a rolling conversation across a mile of July. Then the infantry steps out. From a distance, it looks like a field of grain moving, the line so broad it seems to drag the horizon with it. They march between fences, over a gentle slope, into the teeth of concentrated fire that does not care how well a man keeps in step. Shells plow lanes through the ranks. Officers touch shoulders into gaps. The line knits and unknits and knits again. They reach the low stone wall. Some of them do. And for a moment, the war balances on elbow and flagstaff, on a handful of seconds crowded with too much meaning. Then the balance tips back. The line dissolves, not because courage runs out, but because arithmetic does. Smoke slides across the fields and thins. The cries change pitch. The survivors walk back the way they came, smaller now, carrying away what they can carry. A friend's last word, a flag ragged into lace, a new understanding of what impossible means. Gettysburg is not only a Union victory, it is the Confederacy's narrow door closing. News travels unevenly, by telegraph wire that sings, by newspaper headline that shouts, by letter that murmurs weeks later. But it gets there. The tide has crested. In campfire's hush, some men feel relief, like a drop of cool water. Others feel a long dread, as if the road home will be miles longer than it was yesterday. Meanwhile, far to the west, Vicksburg falls, and the Mississippi slides into Union hands like a captured sentence. 2 names, Gettysburg, Vicksburg, begin to weight the scales. After Gettysburg, the country enters the part of the story where momentum and exhaustion keep company. Campaigns become corridors, long and narrowing, the wilderness crackling with underbrush and fire. Spotsylvania's mule shoe, where men fight hand in rain and mud until the word earthwork feels too small for what the earth is made to do. Cold Harbor's murderous minutes that stretch into an hour, men will remember with bitterness as sharp as any blade. Grant's strategy is without ornament. Hold Lee, press Lee. Do not let him breathe without paying for it. People mistake this for indifference. It is perhaps a grim kind of care for the outcome, more than for the day's appearance. In Georgia, Sherman edges Atlanta loose from its defenses like a tooth, and then, having proved his problem-solving, turns to the march that will slice open the Confederacy's pantry and pride. Rails are heated and twisted into Sherman's neckties. Smoke writes black sentences over warehouses and depots. Even those who hate him understand the math. The Confederacy cannot afford this pace. The climax is therefore not only a battle, it is a recognition. In Richmond, paper money thins to tissue. Hope thins with it. Bread lines grow longer. Uniforms grow older. Words grow harsher. In countless towns without famous names, widows learn to fold telegrams and carry on. Men with emptied sleeves learn buttons with patience. Newly freed families learn the routes to school sprung up like green shoots after a fire. On both sides, nightmares visit with authority, and quiet moments, an orange, a hymn, a letter finished, arrive with a holiness that needs no pulpit. Then April. Petersburg breaks. The trenches, which have taught the armies new ways to fear lines of dirt, finally fail. Richmond burns, not from malice only, but from the chemistry of retreat and rumor, and the war's long appetite for tinder. Jefferson Davis packs a government into suitcases and train cars and leaves by a route that feels like a sentence whose subject has been lost. Lee's army, reduced and resolute, slips west, feeling for a path that still leads to food and a plan. The map shows towns most Americans had never heard of. The roads show ruts deep enough to swallow a wheel. At Sailor's Creek, capture. At High Bridge, smoke. At Farmville, rations that arrive just late enough to be a kind of joke nobody laughs at. The Army is a collection of essentials now. Shoes that hurt, a canteen half full, a piece of hardtack wrapped like a relic, a commander who still rides like a man who believes in one more chance. Appomattox Courthouse is not a court so much as a crossroads with manners, a tavern, a few homes, a store, the McLean House with its neat parlor. Grant arrives in a private's blouse splashed with mud, polite and almost embarrassed by the occasion. Lee arrives immaculate, dignity burnished like a saber hilt. They speak like professionals who understand that the future is listening. The terms are generous in the way that keeps a country from bleeding after the wound has closed. Paroles for soldiers, horses kept for spring plowing. Officers allowed their sidearms because forms matter too. Outside, men begin to cheer, and then both commanders do the most important small thing. They ask for quiet. Surrender is not a spectacle, it is a hinge. That hinge swings fast. Other armies follow. Flags are furled. Cannon go quiet, with a silence so loud it startles birds from trees. Camps that smelled of coffee and damp wool and old smoke go green again. Men carry their fear home and call it other names. They carry their grief in plain sight until someone shows them where to set it down. The war does not end so much as it stops moving forward. Its aftershocks will travel for generations. And then, almost at once, the blow that feels too cruel for art. Lincoln, who had weathered 4 years of telegrams and funerals and choices that would have blanched a younger man into indecision, takes an evening to watch a comedy. The theater's lights are tender. The laughter is easy. The war is almost over. The president's hand rests in his wife's, a small island of mercy. A man slips into the box with a plan the size of a nation's sadness. A shot, a leap, a word shouted to make murder into theater. Lincoln's body is carried across the street to a boarding house where a bed too short will hold him while the nation keeps vigil in the cramped, breathless way people do when they do not know where to put their hands. Morning comes, and with it the announcement that he has died. Men weep openly in streets. Women in black fill pews. Newly freed men and women who had folded his name into their prayers stand in doorways, eyes shining with a grief that is also a vow. The days that follow taste of ash and spring. In Washington, among draped buildings and the click of funeral horse hooves on stone, people whisper versions of the same question. Will the peace he imagined survive without the calm that made it believable? In Richmond, where the smoke still clings to brick, Union soldiers sit on stoops with children who have never seen such uniforms and laugh with the relief of men allowed to laugh again. In Savannah and Charleston and Nashville and New Orleans, in hamlets that never knew a mapmaker's love, in contraband camps that are cities of tents and hope, the war's aftermath blooms and wilts simultaneously. Marriages registered for the first time, schools improvised from planks and prayer, night riders testing how much terror the dark can hold. The contradictions stand side by side like two neighbors who wish the other would move. Jubilation that feels like sunlight, exhaustion that feels like winter. The survivors shape their days from limited materials. A Confederate private, paroled, walks home with a paper folded in his pocket and the horse he is permitted to keep for plowing. Not a mercy to him alone, the general had said, but to the nation that must eat. A Union sergeant writes to the mother of the man who saved his life. The letter takes weeks and brings both guilt and grace to a kitchen table worn thin at the edges. A black soldier's widow who never received his pay because bureaucracy learned to be slow whenever her existence required speed, learns to read the letter anyway and hears, inside its careful words, the respect her husband died to claim. In parlors and cabins, in hospitals and churches, people begin the long negotiation between memory and moving on. They carve names into headstones and into stories. They learn which silence to keep and which to break. On battlefields, the summer returns with a stubborn confidence. Wheat grows over places where men fell in lines. Children chase each other between stones. Farmers haggle over pasture rent, where brigades once argued about ground with gunpowder. The earth swallows lead and grief and gives back, in time, grass and daisies. But in the minds of those who stood there, the fields are never only fields again. A fence is never only a fence, it is also cover. A ridge is never only a ridge, it is a command. A road is never only a road, it is a line of advance pressed into memory's soil. The nation chooses, not entirely consciously, to hold two feelings at once. There is ruin, debts and empty sleeves, burnt depots and broken families, a White House draped in mourning. And there is a measured hope, not the naive kind that assumes goodness because goodness would be convenient, but the hard kind that chooses a future and sets about building it with splinters still in its hands. Congress argues amendments into being. Teachers sharpen pencils over slates. Preachers choose texts that balance comfort with command. Freedmen's schools ring with recitation. Veterans' halls ring with stories told too loudly because quiet makes the picture sharper. Farms re-sow, shops reopen, newspapers return to markets where the hunger for news has learned patience and skepticism. Gettysburg's peak, Appomattox's handshake, Lincoln's absence, these are the points on which the story turns. But the atmosphere that follows is a long chord resolved, a low hum of rebuilding, of graves tended and laws drafted, of reunions cautious and sudden laughter that sounds surprised to hear itself again. The land holds the war like an old injury that aches before rain, and the people carry forward the knowledge they cannot set down, that a nation is not saved by a single brilliant day or lost by a single dark one, that courage and cruelty both travel easily in crowds, that mercy, extended at a parlor table or across a counter or through a doorway, can be policy as well as personality. As the evenings lengthen and the work of peace takes its first halting steps, a different rhythm returns. Church bells regain their Sundays rather than tolling their casualties. Fiddles in back rooms find tunes that do not have to march. The smell of wood smoke is again only wood smoke. Families sit on porches and talk about rain, about planting, about nothing at all. And the quiet is not the silence of waiting for the next volley, but the ordinary quiet of a day well survived. There is no forgetting. There is no perfect mending. There is simply the stubborn, decent insistence on going on. Out in the fields, where monuments will someday rise, the dust comes down like a hand smoothing a wrinkled cloth. The war is over. The echo remains, softer each year, but steady, a reminder, and, against all odds, a kind of promise. There is a hard sentence at the heart of this war, and it is not written in law books or carved on memorials. It is the quiet admission that a nation asked brothers, literal and figurative, to aim at one another, and for years they did. The phrase brother against brother has become a phrase of convenience, polished by repetition until it almost slips past the tongue without friction. But it meant fathers who recognized a son's gait through smoke and could not reach him. It meant cousins who exchanged letters in winter and bullets in summer. It meant neighbors who knew the same hymns and found themselves harmonizing, briefly, only at funerals. What does that say about human nature? Perhaps that we carry, all at once, the capacity to be bound to each other, and the habit of forgetting the binding when fear, pride, or profit insist loudly enough. Perhaps that loyalty, when detached from justice, becomes a tool that can be used against the hand that forged it. Yet even in the worst of those years, there were gestures that refused to learn hatred's grammar. A canteen passed across a stone wall to a mouth that had been an enemy 5 breaths earlier. A letter delivered after a battle to the family on the other street, with a note that read, "He was brave. Tell them he was brave." A chaplain who muttered 2 prayers, one for each side, knowing that God's patience is larger than men's categories. If brotherhood can become a wound, it can also become a salve. And that, too, says something about us. That even when institutions harden, people can remain permeable to mercy, and a single mercy can keep a corner of the world from closing. The war forced a reckoning with the word we. Who fit inside it? Who was pushed to its margins and told to wait for a kinder century? The struggle to enlarge that pronoun is the American story told again and again. The Civil War sharpened the point of the question until it could cut. Enslaved people, who had been made to stand outside the word as if outside a house in winter, stepped across its threshold, took off their shawls, and said their names. The nation, shocked, began, imperfectly, incompletely, to make room. It took amendments, and the stubbornness of widows, and the iron patience of teachers. It took votes won and stolen and won again. It took nights when a family kept its lamps low because writers had opinions about who should be free at dawn. But the we widened, and once widened, it kept a memory of its new width, even when attempts were made to narrow it back. That memory is a responsibility. It asks the living to be as brave in kindness as the dead were in battle. Freedom and union are words that sound graceful when said aloud. They travel easily in speeches and look handsome on banners. But in the world where days are made, where bread is baked and roofs are mended and laws are lived, those words demand more muscle than music. The war proved, at a cost past counting, that freedom is not a sentiment and union is not a convenience. Freedom requires structures, law, and custom. that protect the person nobody rushes to protect. It requires an appetite for truth large enough to swallow embarrassment. Union asks that the strong restrain themselves for the sake of the whole, that local pride bend toward common purpose, that we argue in public and forgive in private, and sometimes the other way around. Both ideals consume sacrifice, not because they are cruel, but because human life is limited, and any attempt to fit justice inside it will scrape our knuckles. Still, sacrifice is not only the surrender of life, it is also the remaking of habit. After Appomattox, men who had learned to command learned to listen, and men who had learned to obey learned to speak. Women who had run hospitals from their parlors did not forget how to run things when the drums stopped. They moved their competence into schools and charities and the stubbornly practical corners of civic life. Newly freed families insisted on legal names and legal marriages, on papers that could be unfolded and shown, small documents with large dignity. The country's better angels, tired but unwilling to go to bed, hovered in schoolhouses and courthouses and front porches where neighbors figured out, one mule share at a time, how to be a country again. If human nature can be coiled like a fist, it can also be open like a palm. The war did not change our species. It exposed us. It revealed how quickly fear can turn us into careful accountants of other people's rights, and how quickly courage can turn us into spendthrifts of our own comfort. It taught that grief can sour into grievance or ripen into wisdom, and that which it becomes depends on the stories we choose to tell ourselves when we are alone. It proved that cruelty loves a uniform, but kindness doesn't need one. It showed that institutions will break your heart, and individuals will mend it, and then the individuals will become institutions, and you must attend to them again, with the old care and the old skepticism. What connects this past to anything we might call eternal? Perhaps the simple law that meaning arrives through service. A nation can be large without being generous, rich without being fair, loud without being wise. What makes it something more than a marketplace is the willingness of its people to spend themselves on behalf of people they do not know. The Civil War inscribed that lesson into the land and into the law. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were not inevitable. They were paid for. In the arithmetic of history, they remain a balance due. A promise that must be honored in every generation, by courts and by citizens, by ballots and by small favors performed by tired people at the end of long days. And union, this stubborn wish to remain one, despite differences that feel ungovernable, also asks to be renewed, not admired. It is a discipline, like music or faith. You tune it through practice, in meetings where patience is short, in neighborhoods where memories are long, at family tables where you pass the beans to someone whose vote you cannot understand and make sure they get enough anyway. The Civil War demonstrated what happens when the discipline fails. The years that followed have demonstrated how the discipline can be relearned, not perfectly, not once and for all, but enough to keep faith with the dead and give the living a chance at a quieter century. Now, the evening. The war's books close, one by one, as if librarians were moving through time with soft shoes. The fields the armies bruised have healed into autumn. The grass that rises here, where cannon once shook the ribs of the earth, is thick and fine. It waves in a breeze that smells of apples and faint smoke. There is a fence, not the old fence, but a fence in the right place, and a line of stones that have learned moss. Goldenrod and asters flank a path worn by curious feet and patient park rangers. The sun lowers itself behind a ridge that once decided a day and now decides the temperature of this hour. Birds, a thrush perhaps, and then a hawk, draw their invisible script across the sky and sign their names with easy loops. In a distant hedgerow, a fox unthreads itself from shadow and disappears, because foxes, unlike soldiers, do not seek applause. Listen, the present is talking. A tractor down the road coughs twice and then settles into work. Children's voices rise and fall and rise again, a choreography of attention and delight. Somewhere, nearer than you think, a family spreads a blanket and opens a basket. Bread, cheese, something wrapped in a clean towel still warm from an oven. They read the plaques and talk about a great-great-grandfather who was here without really knowing if he was here, and the speculation itself is an act of devotion. The leaves, disloyal to summer, begin their transformation. A sugar maple, testing orange at the edges. An oak considering how many acorns a squirrel can fairly be asked to manage. The light relaxes. The wind composes itself. The shadows come gently forward as if to see what the day has made. Under your feet, the ground remembers. Not obsessively, not with spite. More like an old friend who keeps a box of letters tied with string and on certain evenings unties it. The memories do not demand tears. They ask only attention. Here, where the grass thickens, you might be standing over a place where men paused to drink from canteens dirt had flavored. There, where the path dips, you might cross a route a stretcher once took. The weight on it a man trying to become a story and not a statistic. Over there, by the stone wall, a boy, not old enough to vote in the country he was remaking, might have placed his hand and felt the cool grit just before the world widened into noise. The land does not make a speech. It makes a gentle claim that what happened here was real, and because it was real, it is now ours to keep safe. Dusk in autumn carries a kind of forgiveness. It smooths the angles of monuments and turns metal into silhouette. The names carved in granite lose their sharpness and gain, instead, a soft authority. The flags, faded fabric under glass by day, are taken in by the dark, and for a few hours belong to the same wind as the trees. In that light, differences that were once weaponized return to their correct scale. A uniform becomes cloth. A position becomes a hill. An argument becomes a paragraph in a longer book. The living, walking between markers, speaks softly without being told to. And the soft speech is not reverence for violence, but respect for survival. For the way a country, damaged, decided to keep going. If you stand long enough, you will hear what the birds say when they think nobody is grading their song. If you breathe long enough, you will taste the faint iron in the soil and the sweet rot of leaves that have agreed to become next year's ground. The wind does what wind does: visits, lingers, moves on. The sky invents colors that can't be named without sounding sentimental. Pewter, rose, the particular blue that belongs to a single half hour in October. A bell, church, school, or the barn's old triangle, answers the hour. Lamps brighten in farmhouses and on porches, and down the slope in town. Each a small affirmation that night is not a threat, but a shared condition. What, finally, does the war ask of us in this quiet? Not an elaborate performance, not perpetual grief. It asks us to keep the promises the dead purchased. That law will shelter the vulnerable. That citizenship will mean more than paperwork. that the phrase equal protection will be read as if someone you love were standing under it in the rain. It asks us to let our arguments be thorough and our enmities brief. It asks us to remember that the other side of conviction is curiosity, and that a nation grows wiser when it suspects, at least sometimes, that it might be wrong. It asks us to be patient with the machinery of change and impatient with the glamour of cruelty. It asks for work, ordinary, repeating work, that feels small until it isn't. When full night finally comes, it comes the way a curtain falls at the end of a concert you didn't realize had rescued you until the applause begins. The stars, indifferent but available, take their places. The field cools, the dew rises, the insects attempt one last chorus, and then give the stage to crickets with better stamina. The road home waits without opinion, and the ground, this ground, rests, busy with its own chores, turning leaf to loam, nest to memory, memory to lesson. Tomorrow will bring rangers with keys and maps, students with notebooks, veterans who will stand a little apart, families who will promise to come back when the leaves are brighter. The wind will lift again. The grass will lean and then stand straight. If you listen closely as you leave, the land will let you take a small thing with you, not a relic, a responsibility. The knowledge that the words freedom and union were once so costly that men and women reach past fear to pay for them, and that the bill still arrives, routinely, in the unglamorous mail of daily life. To answer it is not to reenact the war. It is to practice a kind of peace that deserves a capital letter. A peace made not of silence, but of speaking carefully. Not of sameness, but of fairness. Not of forgetting, but of choosing what to remember and how. The birds settle. The last light drifts along the edges of the stones and withdraws, polite as a guest who knows it will be welcome another night. Across the field, the grass moves in long, thoughtful waves, as if the earth itself were breathing. You step back onto the road, into the present with all its noise and need, carrying a gentle weight that is not a burden, but a balance. Behind you, the autumn field returns to being a field. Ahead, the country you inherit, complicated, hopeful, unfinished, asks for your hand in the work. And the evening closes, not with a command, but with a quiet agreement between land and sky and the people who walk between them. Remember, repair, continue. Evening gathers its small certainties. Somewhere, a church bell counts the hour with the steady patience of someone mending a fence. One, then another. The sound rounding off as it travels over roofs and lanes. In a field where the earth once jolted under artillery, crickets take up the work of timekeeping. Voices thread through. A father calling children in from the last of the light. A porch conversation slipping into laughter. The soft instruction of a mother spelling out a word at the kitchen table. The nation's ordinary music, unremarkable and indispensable, returns to pitch. The fields, long since replanted, lean in a slow tide. Wheat hisses against itself. Clover offers up a sweetness the wind is happy to share. A stone wall, this one, that one, holds both lichen and memory. Names carved in granite feel less like announcements and more like reminders. Here they stood. Here they were brave or afraid, which is to say, they were human. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the old cadence recede. Drums rolled once. Boots fell in time. Orders cut the air into verbs. Now the commands are quieter. Tie this gate. Bank that fire. Write that letter to the cousin you've neglected too long. The cities find their evening faces. In New York, Window light piles up the sides of buildings like a stack of lanterns. Over rivers and rails, the final whistle smooth into a hush. In Richmond, the scarred brick cools and darkens. A breeze slips along the James as if to say, "Mercy, mercy." In Chicago, the grid hums, ambition softened by nightfall, while a street musician chooses a tune that knows when to stop. Across the map, the same simple ritual repeats. Shops close, steps slow, street talk thins, and somewhere a last newspaper is folded and set aside with the frankness of a finished day. Voices remain, the thing the war could not subtract. A hymn in a small church, sung a little off-key, floats through an open window. A teacher, late, chalks a word on the blackboard for the morning's lesson, citizen, and lets the dust fall like the gentlest snow. A veteran, on a bench, tells a story to a child who, halfway through, leans against his shoulder and believes every word. In kitchen light, a widow seals a jar against winter, her movements exact, her thoughts elsewhere and here. Newly freed families share bread and news and the quiet audacity of plans. The future, unshowy, goes on being assembled by hands. The monuments do what monuments do: stand, witness, wait. But the bigger memorial is the weather of our living, how we disagree without breaking, how we reach where it would be easier to withdraw, how we teach the young the difference between noise and music. Bells toll when necessary and then go still. Fields give grain when tended. Voices argue and forgive in the same week. No trumpet announces this labor. It accrues invisibly, like topsoil, and is just as crucial. Night leans down. Barn lamps blink on like low constellations near at hand. Far off, a train threads its single note through the dark and is gone. The last children are ushered inside. Doors close with that familiar, forgiving thud. A breeze touches the flag and leaves it be. Silence, not absolute, but kindly, takes its place among the houses and along the hedgerows, the sort that lets a heart find its metronome again. We have walked from thunder to murmur, from the clangor of volleys to the click of a latch, from speeches carved into marble to promises practiced at supper tables. What endures is not a perfect agreement about the past, but a usable devotion to the common life. Step lightly, the ground seems to say. Speak carefully, the air suggests. Go on, the stars advise without speaking at all. And so, in this gentle hour, we part from the era that remade us, saluting its courage, grieving its cruelties, accepting its unfinished instructions. The bells, the fields, the voices, they remain, tuned now to a quieter register, carrying forward what the loud years taught. The path home is clear enough. The work tomorrow is known enough. The rest, as ever, is in our keeping. The war ended, but its echoes still linger, like a faint drumbeat beneath the soil of America.